Right, hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be having a look at implementing a custom Tonemapper in Unreal 4, but we're going to start with a bunch of theory. I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I'm just going to explain what the Tonemapper is, what it's doing, why we do it and why it's been implemented the way it has, and then we'll have a look at how we can replace it and why we might want to do that. So first off, we're going to start with a little bit of biology. So the human eye has evolved to deal with lots of different lighting conditions. We need to be able to work in the dark by candlelight and also big bright sunny days. And the way we do that is our pupil dilates. So in low light conditions, the pupil actually gets bigger, lets more light in, and this is kind of the biological response to dealing with lots of different lighting conditions. And that's what we're going to be talking about today with the Tonemapper and also with exposure. So our game engine or the game environment might have lots of different lighting conditions in, and we need to be able to deal with that artificially because we're working digitally, but there's sort of the human response to that, or the way that we do it naturally, is with this sort of pupil dilation. And if we have a look in Unreal, I'm just going to turn off the HDR visualizer. So if I go in here to show, visualize, and turn on HDR brackets here, eye adaptation, this is just going to give me a histogram view effectively of how the brightness of the pixels in the scene are distributed. So here we can see we've got quite a few bright pixels. If I go and just look at the floor, we're now down here in a darkened area. If I look back up at the sky, you can see these values sort of changing. And one thing you might notice, this blue line moving up and down and adjusting. So what we currently have is the default, which is the automatic eye adaptation in the exposure. If I go up to the lit view and turn off game settings, I can now adjust my exposure value, or the EV100 here, and we can see how we can make a huge difference to our lighting. Massively overexposed, everything's going to go very white. This is equivalent of our pupils sort of dilating, or going very much the other way, and we can only see the very bright areas now, and everything else is kind of crushed to blacks. Now, generally in games we have some variability in our lighting, and so we use an auto exposure, and so the default settings here are for that to sort of brighten up and darken based on the scene brightness. And if we come in and get really close to this bright value here, we can see our histogram values changing, and then our exposure values changing as well. And we look across and away, it's going to take a few seconds to sort of come back up, and we can change that speed up, speed down settings there as well. If I set these values both to 1, that's just going to disable that, and now we're not getting any eye adaptation at all. Histogram still updates, but you can see where this kind of like white curve is, isn't changing at all, which can be really helpful for lighting portfolio work. I generally want that turned off, because you'll get more control. It's a balance between sort of playability and control. So control of your lighting for artistic direction, you want this off, but if you've got a playable game, you want it on. If I re-enable that, you might have noticed, if I get really close to this bright glowing doorway, as we get sort of more exposure, it actually changes the colour. Now this has gone like a pure bright red, and as we move away from that, as the glow happens, it's actually glowing out to more white. We're still seeing red blooming, so we're still reading that as a glowing red object, but the actual object itself, if we were to sample those pixels, is more in the kind of white stage. And that's what the Tonemapper is doing. So it's affecting the colours as the scene is being converted from a high dynamic range image to a low dynamic range image. So there's effectively two things happening here. There's the exposure itself, which is adjusting the whole kind of brightness of the scene dynamically, and then there's the Tonemapper, and that's adjusting how the very bright values, how the colours in those very bright values get adjusted down as they get kind of crushed down or transferred down into a low dynamic range, because that's all the monitor can render. If you've got an HDR TV, there's some new standards and things with that, but we're talking about sort of historic setups here, where you might have a CRT monitor or a low dynamic range sort of output device. And that's what the Tonemapper is doing. And we can see that changing color, and that's very pure red. And then as the exposure kicks in, it's going to kind of go up to that whiter value. Cool. Hopefully that makes sense. As I say, there is some really good videos about this, which I will link to in the description. This video from Epic talking about implementing the Filmic Tonemapper, which we'll talk about in a second, but they've got some really good history and theory in here as well. And also this one, GDC talk from Alex Fry from Frostbyte, about how they've implemented their Tonemapper. So if we have a look here in the documentation, as of 4.15, they implemented a Filmic Tonemapper in Unreal, and here's sort of the different results. So this is what we're seeing now, these very bright objects sort of blooming out to white, or being tone mapped out to white. And this is realistic. This is how real film would capture information if you used a camera or a video camera, and you had an old school actual kind of piece of film in there. This is the result you would get. And then working digitally, we want to try and reproduce that or replicate that. The old Tonemapper had these very kind of emissive objects, and they would just get bright and emissive. Looks weird now after seeing the sort of realistic one, but this is how it used to be before 4.15. Lots more information in here, and like I say, those two videos as well, worth checking out. So what's actually happening with our Filmic Tonemapper? Well, if we come down here to these curves here, actually let's go back over here first. So let's have a look at some examples of tone mapping. So hopefully this is going to come across with the YouTube compression. So this is an image. Obviously it's a very bright day outside. We're an interior photo, and a lot of the detail here in these windows is being lost. So this is just a clamp. So effectively what this is saying is any values that are too bright to be rendered, just clamp them out to white, and we get horrible loss of detail in here, same in the roof. And this is a very simple way to do this, and this is how kind of old school mobile phones would work. Some of the sort of very not clumsy, but a very sort of simple way to do this, a very kind of like cheap and simple, but we lose a lot of detail. That's not a very nice pleasing image, and it's not what we'd see in kind of like in film and things either. So there's a better way to do this. So one implementation, don't worry too much about the sort of mathsy side of it, we'll get to that later, but a Reinhardt implementation, and you can see here in comparison we're getting a lot more detail here in the roof, a lot more in the windows as well. So this is a different algorithm of converting that high range down to a low range. So we haven't just clamped it and said, right, all those values are too high, we'll ignore them. We've sort of crushed it. We've changed the range so that there's more information to be able to be kind of rendered on the screen. More pleasing image, more information, and more kind of naturally responsive. Now this simple Reinhardt is using a linear response. So effectively it's taking all those values and just scaling them down until they fit within the 0 to 1. But our eyes are very non-linear. If we go down here, where is it? Let me find the example. 1 second, we'll get to that. I'll put these links in the description as well, so you can come and check this out yourself later. But yeah, our eyes are very non-linear. If we have a very dark room, no lights at all, and we add one candle, that's going to have a huge impact on the lighting. If we add a second candle, well, it's going to get brighter, but not to the same extent as that first candle. Same, if we have 100 light sources already and we add another one, you'll barely notice a difference because it's not a kind of linear progression to that. So what we want to do to try and preserve as much information as possible is we want to have sort of different treatments for the different areas of our image. So we have one kind of mapping for the darks or the blacks areas, one for the sort of main body of the image, and then again for the sort of really brights. And we're trying to preserve as much information and kind of create the most pleasing images, and also replicate that kind of response that we see with physical film. So that was our clamp. This is our sort of linear response. It's a bit difficult not seeing them side by side, but you can see the sort of the colors here in the sort of the midtones. There's a richness to this that when we get to the linear response, it's kind of been lost again because of that clamping down. So we want to get our top ranges successfully without affecting our mid ranges, and also kind of like, yeah, our dark's going to be treated differently as well. Come down here. Let's see if I can find an actual curve. 1 second. Here's some more side by sides. No, where's a good curve? Here we are. So this is the kind of response that we're talking about. So our mid values here are being generally unaffected. Our darks being remapped so that we're not getting too much information there where we don't need it. Our eyes are very bad at seeing dark values, so we don't need to store lots of dark values because the eyes won't notice them anyway. And conversely, lots of information in the light, so we're keeping the very bright values within range, and so we get this S curve. And this is what the sort of the Filmic Tonemapper is doing, keeping the dark values, giving us more information in the light values, but keeping the sort of midtones correct. Cool. Settings for that. In our post-process volume, you have a setting called film, and this adjusts the values. So we'll break this down further in a minute when we look at implementing our own one, but effectively we have 3 parts to our curve, to our Tonemapper. The slope is the sort of linear middle section, and if I adjust this, you can see we're getting a very flat grey, or we can kind of bump up the contrast if I push this all the way up to 1, and you can see that effect that's happening, having. Our toe, that's that small sort of blacks area. We can see we're affecting the darker areas of the scene here, and then the shoulder, that's the brighter areas. And so if I push that up and down, you can maybe see around the door the kind of difference that's having. Black clip, generally we don't ever edit the black clip. Black wants to stay black, but there's an option there for it. And then our white clip, you can adjust the brights as well. Not having a huge effect, at least in this scene. So why might we want to implement our own Tonemapper? Hopefully now we have a bit of an idea about what it is and what it's doing. As I say, please do check out these other videos and links if you want to know a bit more about it. But this image, so this is where it all started. One of my students was trying to sort of emulate this this piece by Alex Beddows. This is based off this concept by Giles Ketting. And you'll notice that the lighting is incredibly saturated. It's very bright, it's very red. Obviously we're trying to convey a very specific mood here. And while often in games we're trying to replicate a realistic or filmic response, we also have stylized games. We have stylized lighting, it's used in film as well. And so sometimes we want to be able to edit that, and that's where this this kind of whole process started. Now looking at this image, you can see it's got these kind of red saturated lights, and there's actually a breakdown. So here on experience points, there's a breakdown of the whole scene and how it was made, and he mentions in here that it's using the GT Tonemapper. Now I did a quick Google and happened to find the GT Tonemapper is here. This is a graphical calculator. You might have seen this before in some other videos. It's a great way to sort of demonstrate certain concepts. Now this GT, that stands for Gran Turismo. This is what was implemented in the Gran Turismo game. They wanted to use a slightly more saturated lighting, and so they implemented their own Tonemapper rather than using the sort of filmic one that Unreal uses. If I jump back quickly here, there is lots of different Tonemappers. They're effectively just mathematical algorithms, so it isn't necessarily saying that this is the right one, this is the wrong one. It's all about what kind of response you're trying to get. And here there's some nice side-by-sides here, so you can see that sort of mid-tone greying. This one here, this is the Uncharted 2 one, so Naughty Dog implemented their own Tonemapper. So different games have used different Tonemappers over the years to try and get different responses and things. But this is the one that was used in Gran Turismo. What we're going to do, or what I have done and will share with you, is this implementation in Unreal. So there's a few settings here, same as we just looked at in Unreal. We have the white point, which we can adjust. Probably want to keep that 1 for now. But our contrast, so that's effectively changing the linear slope section in the middle here. Our toe, and how that kind of curve effectively changes, and then our shoulder, and there's also some, well, that's the toe, so that's something else, maybe a setting we don't have in Unreal. But effectively what this is saying is values here across the x-axis, this is the input brightness. So a value of black or 0 is going to stay black. So the output brightness here on the y-axis, a value somewhere in mid-grey, 0.5, is going to give us a value of about 0.5. But when we get to these bright values, anything up to sort of here 2-3 times brighter than the LDR could display is going to get remapped, and we're going to get this brightness. So values here, or values here I should say, are still going to be visible, and so we're trying to maximize the sort of readability of our scene using this sort of tone mapping. If I break this down briefly, if we look in here, there is the linear section. Let's disable the final curve. So this is our sort of midpoint. So effectively, like I said, there's 3 curves here that we're sort of blending together. So this is our midtones, and that's just a linear response. So anything that's about 0.5 grey stays 0.5 grey, and our sort of mid values can get away with just a linear response, but the very low values this doesn't work, very bright values this doesn't work. So then we have our toe, and our toe curve starts at black and then kind of curves way upwards, so minimizing the amount of information we have with our blacks, and then our shoulder the other way around. So here, this is the definition of the curve, and we're just kind of like using this bit. So values up here that are quite bright stay with a lot of information. If I turn all of those on and then have a look at the final result, you can kind of see how our curve here, this orangey one, is taking the sort of the initial toe curve, then the linear section, and then the shoulder section, and that's how we're kind of defining this. So, as I say, I have implemented this into Unreal. If I open up the material, I'm using 4.27 for this. Definitely recommend moving to 4.27, 4.27 or 5 at least, because of these things, named variables. So especially useful for this kind of thing when we're converting sort of algebra into a shader, but for any of your shaders, these things are incredibly useful. It's a way of storing data. You might call them variables. Unreal calls them named variables. So all I've done here is created a parameter, in this case maximum brightness. This was corresponding to P up here, maximum brightness P, and then we're just going to store that as a variable, and that's going to make things a lot easier to be able to do our algebra. Very simple. Pull off, just called named reroute, that's what it's called here, named reroute declaration node. Give it a name, and now whenever we want to access this variable, this value later on, we can just open up here our named reroutes and get that from there. So really, really useful way of doing this. Keeps a nice clean graph. If this was just done with sort of traditional variables, this would be a total mess. But thankfully, these named variables make this a lot easier. So what have we done? Well, here I have declared the variables. So all those bits of information at the start, those values that we can edit by name for ease of editing later on, and then algebraically for ease of using in our equations. If we have a look back at our graph, it's very clearly broken down nicely. So the linear region, there's a few sub-calculations. So P minus M multiplied by L all divided by A gives us our L0, and then capital L0, capital L1, and then these values are then used in our sort of final equations. And so that's all I've done, is just transposed that into the sort of graph editor. So here our linear region, P minus M multiplied by L divided by A, and just stored that out as another named variable. That works nicely for our linear region, our toe, and our shoulder. giving us a few more variables, and then the final sort of input or final sort of result that we want is using these weighting values. Now this is basically just saying we want to use the curve, or the toe curve between here and here, then the linear curve between here and here, and then the shoulder curve from there onwards. And so rather than using it in the weighting values here, I've just done it with a series of if nodes. So we're comparing our parameters for how far along on that curve is with x, and x is our brightness of our pixel. So we're saying if the brightness of the pixel is above a certain value, well, we'll use the linear curve. If it's below a certain value, we'll use the toe curve, and that's what this tx and lx are. And then that deals with the bottom part, and then for the up part or the top part, we'll just compare that combined curve with another value and our sx to get our final result. Hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to share this so you can just copy and paste it into your projects and have a look. But I didn't want to go through one by one. I don't think that would make a very useful video. But yeah, just following through the algebra. So what result does that get us? Well, let's implement it first, and then we'll talk about a little bit more, a few more things. So this is our result. This is our GT Tonemapper applied to our scene. If I bring this down here, we can see we're still getting that kind of blooming red, and we're still getting that emissive colour, and that's sort of what we wanted in terms of our sort of stylized, very saturated red colours. We have controls similar to the ones we had here, so the black tightness, the contrast, our linear section. Obviously certain values are going to break, so we have to keep within certain ranges, but you can see how we can edit our scene here and adjust these values, and we're no longer getting that kind of blowing out to white as the adaptation kicks in. We'll see it's always going to stay very, very bright red, which is what we wanted. Now one little thing, one more section in our graph. If I open this up, this one. Now I talked about the brightness of our pixel. Well, we've got two choices for how we define the brightness. So we could either deal with our red channel, our green channel, and our blue channel independently, and then combine them back together and sort of tone map them all separately. But what you'll get with that is as the brightness of the red gets very high, and then the green values sort of come up, and you'll get color clipping, so you'll get color variations because you're treating them as separate values. So instead we're going to work with a thing called luminance. If I go back over to this example, as I say, these will all be linked in the description, comments below, so you can come and have a look at this yourself. But we're going to use a thing called luminance. So we talked about the human eye being non-linear, but it's also not equally good at picking up colors. So we have 3 color receptors, red, green and blue, but our green ones are much more sensitive. The green color vision has been around longer in terms of evolution, then red developed later, and blue most recently. But what that means is that our color values, or our color perception in terms of brightness, is weighted. You think about the natural world around, lots of greens to be visible in the natural world, very few blues, it's mostly just sky, and then red for sort of somewhere in the middle. And so what we want to do for our conversion from red, green and blue values, we don't want to treat them independently because we'll get kind of color variations that we don't want. So instead we're going to convert them to a thing called luminance, and it's using this equation here. I guess from some mathematical modelling and research, and not entirely sure how they've worked this out, but presumably experimentally. But our red input is 0.2, our green input 0.7, and our blue input somewhere here just below 0.1. Once we have a luminance value, we can tone map that value using that curve that we've defined, and then all we need to do is multiply our original colour by the ratio of our untone-mapped value to our final tone-mapped value. So L in is our input value for L out is our tone-mapped values, and we're multiplying that by our C in, which is our input color, to get our output color, and that's what we're doing here. So broken out my red, green, and blue values, multiplied by the various factors here to create our X value, or in this case our L in value, which are both the same. Then our tone mapper all works on X, and then finally, last thing, our C input value or color input, just multiplied by that ratio to get the final result. Cool. Hopefully that is interesting and makes sense. A couple more things. If you don't want to implement your own tone mapper, there's a couple of easier ways to do this if you just want to get those colored saturated highlights. So if I just turn this off, go back to our default Filmic Tonemapper, which is the Unreal default. In our post-process values, here in color grading under the miscellaneous, there's two settings here, tone curve amount and expand gamut. And this allows us to kind of scale the application of that Filmic Tonemapper. So if I set both of these to 0, you can see we're getting the same result as if we weren't using the Filmic Tonemapper at all. So this is now the legacy Tonemapper equivalent. So very simple way to go in and just kind of adjust these values here. You might get some sort of color erroring. Depends what you're doing. See if I can kind of do it. Yeah, so you can kind of see how we're getting kind of purpley here instead of our reds. That's that RGB tone mapping independently. So there's some issues with this implementation, but as a quick kind of response or quick result, you might just be able to get away with adjusting these values. Instead, alternatively, if you want a heavy-handed result or heavy-handed approach, you can just turn the Filmic Tonemapper off entirely. So console command here, r.tonemapper film space 0, and that will just disable it. And now we're using the legacy Tonemapper as shown in here, and that's that result we're getting here. So the fallback here is that legacy Tonemapper if the Filmic one is disabled. One last little bit, how do we actually implement this as a material? Well, once you've set your material here, the material domain we're using is post-process rather than surface. And then if we scroll down here, down at the bottom, there's a post-process section, and then we want to change this to be replacing the Tonemapper. And so that gives us then a material that will replace our Tonemapper. We create a post-process material, post-process volume here. So we select our post-process. To apply this, we just come down to our post-process materials, add an element to the array. We want to use an asset reference, and there we can apply our Tonemapper. Now I would say it's easier to apply an instance. If we're using an instance, we're able to edit it and see the results in runtime. If we just assign the material, that will need compiling every time you make changes, so I would use an instance for this, and that will give us the control that we want and the implementation. Yeah. If you don't want to make it yourself, I have created a Pastebin. Again, I will share this in the link below. This is the material. You should just be able to do a copy, select all this, copy the code, create a new material, and paste. And it should paste all that information in, I believe, with all the data and all the connections and everything. And then the only thing to do is connect up the final output to emissive and set it to be post-process and instead of Tonemapper, replacing the Tonemapper. There we go. And that should work as well. So, cool. As always, hope that has been helpful and informative. If you do have any questions, please let me know below or send me an email, and I will see you all. A big thank you to all my patrons for supporting the channel. do like, comment and subscribe, and yeah, hopefully that's helpful. I will see you all next time.